So I think the mark of a truly great interpersonal communicator is that in the middle of an argument, they can just look at someone and go, you know what, I changed my mind. I started this argument and I've decided it's not interesting or worth my time. All right, module 1. Got my root beer, got my notes, ready to go. Okay, so 1 of 7. Get used to my face. You're gonna be seeing a lot of it. All right, so the first module of this class feels a lot like sort of an intro to psych class. And the reason for that is you have to kind of understand what a totally bizarre and illogical place your brain is to really, really grasp interpersonal communication. The biggest problem I see with interpersonal communication is that people think they're more rational than everyone else. Okay, the first one is salience, S-A-L-I-E-N-C-E. Salience is the principle that only certain things in your environment, certain stimuli, will cause you to have attention toward them, right? So a stimuli is just anything that causes you to pay attention to it. And you get so much stimuli on a daily basis. I mean, it's unreal how much stimuli you get. Your brain cannot take in all of it with equal measure. That's the first way in which you're just not a logical person. Because a logical person would be able to look at every single piece of stimuli and equally assess it and think about whether it went right. And you just don't have the time or the bandwidth for all of that. And so your brain takes shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts is this principle of salience. And essentially there are 3 things that, 3 reasons why you might find something salient over something else. First of all, it's stimulating to the senses, right? It's visually or audibly stimulating. It's an overpowering kind of smell. I mean, it's something that is sensory, right? Okay, that's salience. Next, we've got punctuation. So punctuation is a cute little theory. And it's based on the word punctuation, like when you say your punctuation when you write. Because what punctuation is when you write is just putting different marks into your word flow to indicate breaths or the ends of thoughts, right? Punctuation is not real. If you were blind and couldn't write, a comma would not exist to you. A comma and a period and a semicolon and an em dash, they're all just invented things. Because to you, all there is words, silence, and breath. That's all. Right? Writing invented everything else. So punctuation is just kind of the arbitrary choice of where you put symbols to make sentences make sense. And, you know, where you put the symbol changes the meaning of the sentence. So let's eat, grandma, exclamation point, versus let's eat grandma, exclamation point, right? So that's like a common example. All right, so the basic lesson here is, you know, there's that phrase like there's your truth, there's my truth, and then there's the truth. And that's how punctuation is. Yes, you're going to have like this whole series of logical explanations for how certain things went down. You need to be willing to be wrong. And if you ever get into a fight with someone about who started X, squash that shit. It's not helpful. And find a better question to ask. All right. Now we get to the 2 S's, I call them. The first S is your schemata. S-C-H-E-M-A-T-A. It looks like schemata. And then your stereotype. You know what a stereotype is. So let's start with the stereotype, because you've heard this word, right? Don't stereotype. Stereotyping is bad. Women are bad drivers is a stereotype. Asians are good at math is what we call a glittering stereotype, because it's positive but still damaging, because it treats a whole group as if they are like one type of person. And I know a lot of Asians that are bad at math. It's just not a true stereotype, right? Some are, but that's how a stereotype works. So the thing is your brain loves to stereotype, right? Because it's minimal effort. It's a lot easier to be like, okay, I've met one Asian. I now know everything about Asians. Bam, check that off in my brain, because then your mind doesn't have to do a lot of work at individually cataloging every person you meet and creating multiple subgroups so that you can organize information more accurately. It just wants to do it quick. So that doesn't mean you're off the hook. So just because stereotyping is kind of an inevitability doesn't mean that you have to do it. I mean, certainly you're a human being, you're not a child, you're a grown-up, you're an adult, and we can all push back on stereotypes. Like, we all have the mental bandwidth to do this work. We just have to choose to want to do it. So yes, it's challenging. You can't just abruptly say, like, I'm not going to stereotype anymore, because bias is so implicit. I mean, I will mention like a movie that has all black people in it, so I might mention Black Panther, and like without even being able to control it sometimes, my eyes will go to people of color who are in the room, and I can feel it happening, and I've noticed it, and I've started to become more aware of it, but it's an almost instant association, and I have to be very, very responsible for that because it's an automatic association. And when those automatic associations start to predict behavior, then they become stereotypes, right? Because you learned that a certain person or a certain identity group or a certain behavior is associated with certain things. And so now every time you encounter a stimulus from that group, you automatically think, oh, that's how they're going to behave, right? And now, I think a schemata is the same principle. It's a filing cabinet where you organize information so that you can kind of predict behavior and make decisions, but it's subject to revisions. It's very flexible. And so I think of the word classroom, right? So classroom has a schemata. It's got chairs, it's got desks, it's a place we go to learn. It's probably going to be set up so somebody's in charge in the front with like the lectern, and then everyone else is going to be sitting in the rows watching. It might have wheelchairs, it might have movable chairs, but of course the more I teach and the more different classrooms I go to, the more my category of classroom looks so different, because in some classrooms they have beanbags on the chairs, and some classrooms have no chairs, and some classrooms are, yes, they're giant lecture halls, some are outside. And so for me, when someone says like, oh, we're going to meet for this meeting in a classroom, I don't know. I mean, I kind of generally know what to expect, but I usually like to ask what kinds of stuff is going to be in there so I can plan accordingly. It takes a lot more mental energy than just to envision 25 desks and chairs in a room with a lectern up front and me sitting in the back, right? That's just easy. It happens fast. Now, what's the difference between a Greek life file and a classroom file? Right? Why is one a schemata and one's a stereotype for me? Well, because the stakes are higher. So for the Greek life, there's a lot more consequence that comes from making a mistake, putting my faith in the wrong person, believing in somebody who turns out to be a bad person, somebody who's going to violate my trust. Whereas a classroom, it's like, how much is really going to go wrong if I predict an outcome or try to reduce uncertainty and I'm wrong about it? So part of the problem is the reason you stereotype in some situations, but you can have a schemata in others, is because there's a lot more riding on getting it wrong. But the truth is that critical thinking, right, this thing that you're supposed to go to college to know how to do, the best definition I can think of for critical thinking is having way fewer stereotypes and way more schematas. Because schematas are flexible and revisionable, and stereotypes are not. And so the more you can turn stereotypes back into schematas, and the more you can break up stereotypes into sub-schematas, and the fewer stereotypes that you can have, the more flexible and supple your thinking is, and the better it is, honestly, for your brain and your ethical treatment of people and your relationships. So there are these two things called the halo and the horn effect, and these are pretty basic. The halo effect just means that if you perceive a certain negative trait about something, you're more likely to see everything that they do as negative. The horn effect is, that's the horn effect, sorry. The horn effect is if you see somebody doing something negative or you perceive they have a negative trait, everything else they do is likely to be negative, right? So for example, if I find out Greg's in a fraternity and I have this fraternity stereotype, and then it's like, well, after that, Greg can't do anything right. That would be a horn effect. It's another type of stereotyping. The halo effect is the opposite. You see somebody good and who like has a good trait or who has associated with something that you have positive feelings about, and so everything they do is good. Of the stereotyping. Now, essentially what a stereotype is it's a predetermined category of where like your stimuli, like it's an organizational category for your stimuli, but it's fixed. Because as you get competing information that doesn't match your stereotype, you justify it or discard it so that it doesn't demand revision. So here's like my little filing cabinet for Greek life. And every time I find, right, so back to the principle of salience, every time I find an example that meets my expectations, I stick it in the bin, right? And then also assumed similarity is another problem that we have, because when we meet people and we don't have certain information, we will fill in the gaps based on what we would do. And that's a problem, I think, especially like in the student-teacher relationship, because if I treat you like I would treat me, we're going to have problems, because I am very, very different from many of you, including the fact that I voluntarily decided I wanted to be an academic, and many of you are kind of like kicking and screaming to be college educated. So I can't treat you like you have intrinsic motivation to learn about language, right? Because I have intrinsic motivation developed over many, many years. That would not be a fair assumption to make of you. Two more. Okay, so that's the assumed similarity. The other thing we do with other people, in addition to kind of like assuming that they're like us in the personality characteristics, is that we make social comparisons. And if you've ever heard the saying, comparison is the thief of joy. That's where this comes from. So social comparison is just basically the fundamental human behavior to compare yourself to others and contrast yourself, right? So compare, look for likenesses to other people, and contrast, look for differences. This is just a fundamental human behavior. You're never going to stop doing it. But again, like all things, just because you do it instinctively doesn't mean you can't do it more intentionally, and you can't train your brain to use social comparison for better effect. So there's downward social comparison and there's upward social comparison. Downward social comparison is a defensive tendency that's used as a means of self-evaluation. So typically if we're downward social comparing, it's defensive. We're doing it because something about us doesn't feel right, and so we try to make ourselves feel better, right? We try to make a more positive self-evaluation by looking down at another person to make ourselves feel better. Now, in the short term, this can be effective, right? If you're feeling like you're not thin enough or attractive enough and you want to go look at some pictures of unattractive people and say like, well, at least I'm not doing badly. It'll work for a very short time, but it's a very cheap and sad way to make yourself feel better. It also becomes a really nasty habit where putting other people down is the way that you make yourself feel better. And that's terrible because it means that your happiness and self-fulfillment relies on your explicit or implicit denigrating of other people. So when you look at another individual or group and consider them to be worse off than you, it makes you feel better about yourself or your personal situation. But of course, it's not a real feel better. It's temporary, and also it only works as long as you're surrounded by people who you perceive as less than you. But it never, of course, works then when you're around people that you perceive as better than you. And that also might mean that you purposefully surround yourself with people just to look down on them. And you may not even be doing this consciously, but you do need to notice that this is a tendency that you have, and you want to try and curb the feelings of instant gratification you get when you look at someone else and feel better about yourself because they are struggling. That is a super shitty way to go through life, and it's a terrible way to build self-esteem. So we want to watch for that. And the last one we have is related to this social comparison thing. So it's based on social comparison. It's called our attributions. So attributions are when we look at people and their behavior, do we attribute their behavior to internal stable causes, or do we attribute their behavior to external stable causes? And same is true of ourselves. Like when we make a mistake, is it an internal, something is wrong with me, I'm an idiot, I can't do this attribution? Or is it a, meh, it was a circumstance, I was learning, I didn't ask for enough help, I needed more instructions, I was crunched for time, right? External attribution. So for example, if you have a friend who's like very monotone, and when they speak, it's not particularly engaging, and you're used to hearing them speak a lot, when they start to speak, it might be easier for you to just go like, than someone whose voice is maybe more attention getting because it's more stimulating to the senses. 2, you will find salient things that match your goal or objectives. So that essentially means when you're already set on a path to find something salient, you will find it salient, right? So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if like for me, for example, I notice the word rhetoric everywhere because I'm a rhetorician. And so I think a lot about that word, and I don't like the way that people use it in kind of these, to mean like fake talk. So I notice that word a lot, but to somebody who's never thought about that, they're not even going to notice the word. So it matches my goals or objectives, right? It's something that I kind of think about, so I'm already on the lookout for. Likewise, if you sort of, I don't know, let's say you get a text from your roommate and it kind of seems like they're in a bad mood, and you start to get in your head like, oh shit, they're in a bad mood, they're in a bad mood. You're going to be looking when you get home for cues that your roommate is in a bad mood because you primed your brain for that to be the expectation. And so you might go home and notice this person is in a bad mood, but never once did you confirm that with them. You just kind of were geared to notice these particular behaviors. And then third, you're going to find salient things that deviate from your expectations. So if you expect something to be one way, you are going to notice things that don't match those expectations. If they match your expectations, you wouldn't notice them, right? Because why would you notice something that just is exactly what you expected? And of course, this is the problem. So if you've ever heard, like, when people give reviews of restaurants or places online, like Yelp reviews or whatever, there's this saying that you get like 3 or whatever bad reviews for every good review that you get. And that's because people notice when they have bad food at a restaurant because their expectation is not to go out to a restaurant and have bad food or bad service, right? Their expectation is to go out and have good service. And when we think about this in the context of interpersonal communication, when you go out and expect for people to act a certain way, like if you expect them to be polite, or you expect them to listen to you, or you expect them to be available, you're not even going to notice when they are, and you're not going to appreciate it because you already expected people to act that way. If you don't expect that, if you expect people to like sometimes be shitty and sometimes be nice, and just kind of like not lower your expectations in the sense you expect people to be bad, but like if you just kind of expect that everyone's going to show up like not as their best selves all the time, then when people do show up as their best selves, you're more likely to show gratitude for that. So I use the phrase under promise, over deliver. And that's the same thing for your expectations, right? You should under expect so you can be over pleasantly surprised when someone does something that deviated from your expectations in a positive way. Because if your expectations are high, you never notice all of the good that's around you. So you will find salient communication that stimulates the senses, matches goals or objectives, and deviates from expectations. And I'm going to go ahead now and direct you to this video called Awareness Test with the 2 basketball teams. And I want you to watch it. And then when you're done watching it, think about this principle of salience, right? What about it was stimulating to the senses? What about it matched your goals or objectives? And what about it deviated from your expectations? And why is it that you noticed some things and did not notice other things? And of course, if you've already taken the awareness test, this won't work on you. So, all right. In interpersonal communication and psychology, punctuation is the way that you create cause and effect chains to explain events. So what made you come to Geneseo? How did you get enrolled in this class? What made you want to go to college? Why did you drop out of college? Why did you fall in love with that person, right? These are all cause and event questions. There's a chain of events that happened that made X follow Y, follow Z, right? And we think that's true. When we look back on our life, we think, oh yes, first I did X, then I did Y, and then I wound up at Z, and it was like this linear pattern. Or we get home and we notice our partner's in a bad mood, and so then they're being kind of grumpy, and so we're sort of walking on eggshells, trying to make sure they don't get mad, and then they blow up at us, and we're like, I can't believe you did this. You're the one that was mad when I got home. I didn't do anything. And then they say, no, I got home and I was fine, and then you started walking around here looking at me like something was wrong. I mean, it's this idea that we don't know who started the conflict. You look at like the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's like hard to say who started that conflict. It depends where you start in history. It depends on whose perspective you're taking, right? There's so many factors, and so any kind of argument over who started it is just so pointless. And I heard this really good analogy by this. He speaks on race issues. He's a white guy. His name's Tim Weiss, I think. And he gives this analogy where he talks about, like, let's suppose that you live with a bunch of people, and one day you wake up in the morning and somebody made like a pot of like really good chili or whatever you eat, vegetable stew or whatever. And everybody has a little bit of chili, and everybody puts a little bit of like the Fritos on it or the cheddar cheese or whatever, and people are going through, and everybody's eating this chili up, and it's delicious and it's good. And then eventually the chili's over with, and we got this big stock pot of chili and all of these dishes that have to be washed. But nobody knows who made the chili, but everybody ate the chili, and now nobody wants to do the dishes because everyone's saying, well, like, I didn't start the chili, right? So if you know who Billy Joel is, like, we didn't start the fire, this is very much what we're talking about. But now the chili's sitting there, and the pot's been there for days, and there's no clean dishes, and it's starting to stink, and it's starting to rot, but still, like, nobody will clean up the chili, even though everybody ate some of it. Nobody knows who made it, so nobody wants to have to do the dishes. And it's like, at some point, who cares who made it? Just clean up the fucking chili. But of course, at this point, our ego kicks in, and it's like, well, I shouldn't have to do this. It's those expectations, right? It's these unreasonable expectations that, you should never have to do anything that you don't want to do, or you should never have to clean up somebody's mess. And he's using this as an analogy to slavery. And so the chili pot is slavery. At some point, somebody started it. Everyone has partaken in it and benefited from it. And now it comes time to clean up the aftermath, and nobody wants to step in and take responsibility because it's like, well, I didn't make the chili. So that's the issue of punctuation. And an example that I think I struggle with. like people in Greek life, like sororities and fraternities. I grew up with a father who was the worst kind of a fraternity person, and I've hated them my whole life. And then I went and I taught at University of Georgia, where the Greek life is like, it makes this place look like brown, right? Like the Greek life is just all there is there. And I never really had many positive experiences. I'm not gonna lie. I had a lot of students, many of them were fraternity people or sorority people, and very rarely did I have like a positive experience or hear something about a fraternity sorority that really seemed to change my mind about things. And so my stereotype just kept growing, right? This stereotype of Greek life just kept growing. And the more things I heard that just fed into my narrative, the more things I accumulated. But of course, all the time now, especially Geneseo, where I have a better relationship with my students, I meet people all the time that are in Greek life that I really like, who are smart and accountable and interesting and clearly like trying to do the right thing. And so that stereotype kicks in because as soon as someone says Greek life, I want to take everything I've learned about that phrase and apply it to that person. But that's not fair and it's not ethical, right? Just like I don't like when people, like if people apply all of the stereotypes belonging to women to me, right? Or if people apply all the stereotypes of like a professor to me, or if people apply all the stereotypes of an introvert to me, that stuff's not fair and it doesn't feel fair to me. So why would I then turn around and do it to someone else? So I have to be really conscious of the stereotype. And so this could be true for some people for fraternities. So maybe you hear the word like they're in a fraternity and you think there's a halo effect. And now because of that trait or something that you find very salient as a trait, you now predict all of their behavior on that. And it makes it hard for you to see the person as they actually are. You got to use these things to your advantage because you're never going to get rid of them. So I guess the question would be, when is a horn effect to your benefit and when is a horn effect to your detriment and vice versa? So for me, obviously, like encountering a student who goes to a fraternity, I don't want that horn effect to negatively affect them. But for example, if I run into a student taking my Pilates class, maybe I want the fact that they go to Pilates to be a halo effect because now the fact that they've invested in their time and taking classes and they're taking care of themselves physically, that has a positive overall impact on how I think about them. And so I just want to be strategic about where I'm just kind of letting the halo and horn effect happen and where I need to push back against them. Now, the assumed similarity doesn't really work with stuff like music taste or hobbies. I mean, that's not, but it works with personality traits. So later when we talk about the big 5 personality traits, extroversion, conscientiousness, etc., we're going, if we don't know a certain personality characteristic of someone, like whether they prefer to spend their energy alone or whether they like to be in social groups, whether they are very, very neat and organized or whether they like to fly by the seat of their pants. If we don't know that information and we don't have the cues that we need to gather it, we are going to assume that they prefer the thing that we prefer, right? Again, in relation to certain personality traits, not in relation to like what you want for dinner, right? That would be weird. And of course, that's a problem at a predominantly white institution for us to project certain personality traits that are culturally bound, like extroversion, onto people when we don't have the correct information, right? So, and it's tough too, because like as a professor, for example, I have to make certain decisions about how to organize the class and what material to cover and which examples to use when I'm explaining concepts to you. And do I give you a book to read or do I make you videos, right? And I have to be careful that when I'm trying to decide like what kind of person is on the other end of this camera, that I'm not just assuming it's me. Because then I make a lot of assumptions that are lazy and I do a lot of things that would not be helpful to you as novice learners who may be culturally and personality-wise very different from me. All right, then obviously you have the opposite, which is upward social comparison, and that's comparisons that are made to evaluate and self-improve in the hopes that self-enhancement will also occur. So in an upward social comparison, you want to believe that you're part of an elite or superior social group and make comparisons highlighting the similarities between yourself and the comparison group. Unlike a downward social comparison where similarities between individuals and groups are dissociated, so the fact that I and this yoga person have a lot in common, I forget that, right? I ignore that part just so I can sort of like see myself as above them. In upward social comparison, we actually use people who are kind of like doing a little bit better than us as an aspirational move where we can say like, oh, I'm similar, I might be like that someday. Somebody sits down to you next to you in class and it's the first day of class and they don't say hi. Now part of it is like, why did you expect them to say hi? Or they do say hi and you weren't expecting. I mean, again, you came in with some expectations. That's always part of the problem. If you're expecting them to say hi and they don't, your brain, more likely than not, is going to think that, oh, that must be because you're a bad person, right? Your brain wants to take external cues of behavior and read internal states. Why? Because that's more certain. If what you do is a direct indicator of who you are as a person, I can make a lot faster, safer judgments about whether or not you're a friend or foe. So my safety is enhanced because I can quickly decide, okay, you're a bad person. If your external behavior has no relationship, or at least has kind of a sketchy relationship to your internal cues, my brain has to go like, I don't know if anybody's a friend or foe. I guess I'll just have to walk around the planet not knowing if people are going to screw me over. And that's very, very uncomfortable. But fundamentally, that's the way you have to behave. So again, internal attribution is making the assumption that external behaviors or cues, language choice, nonverbals, whatever, dress, signify internal permanent states, character, attitude, right? External attributions are, you see a behavior, a characteristic, right? Something on the outside, something that someone said, and you attribute it to just circumstance, right? Oh, well, we have a test today, so they must be nervous, so it's circumstantial. It's early in the morning, it's awkward. Being in this class is awkward. Meeting new people is awkward. Why would they say hi? It has nothing to do with their personality. So there you go. Those are a couple of theories that I think help sort of not only teach you different ways that you can push back against your perception tendencies, but that also teach you all the ways that your brain is preconditioned to get in the way of you having meaningful relationships, which means you have to be so intentional and so purposeful with how you choose your language. And in the next video, we're going to talk about how a lot of these perception areas influence your sense of self, because your sense of self is the biggest determinant in how you relate to other people. It's not other people's behavior. It's your sense of self and how your sense of self gets wrapped up in some of these perception processes. So stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.